I'll never forget the way he looked at me that night, standing on my doorstep with a bottle of wine and that sly grin. "This stays between us," he said, his voice low and deliberate. If only I'd known what was coming, I would have slammed that door shut right then and there. But I didn't, and it changed everything. "Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm 29, single, and living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever seems to happen. Or at least that's what I thought when I moved here a few months ago. My neighbor, Henry, is the kind of man you wouldn't even notice in a crowd, 62, polite, always offering to help with my trash bins or fixing things around the yard. A perfect neighbor, right? At least, that's what I believed. Until that night. It started earlier in the week when Henry knocked on my door to check in. He said he noticed I'd been working late and offered to help with anything I needed. I thanked him, thinking it was sweet, but something about his tone felt off. Like there was a subtext I wasn't catching. Later that evening, I found a handwritten note tucked under my welcome mat. "You're special. People probably don't tell you that enough, but you should know. H." I laughed nervously. It was harmless, wasn't it? Still, I couldn't shake the strange feeling it left behind. A couple of days later, he came over again. This time with the wine. "Rachel," he started, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I have something I need to talk to you about, in private." The way he said private sent a chill down my spine, but curiosity won. "Okay," I said, stepping aside to let him in. We sat at my small dining table, and he poured us both a glass. His hands trembled slightly as he set the bottle down, but his eyes were steady, locked on mine in a way that felt almost intense. "Listen," he began, swirling his wine as if trying to find the right words. "I've been meaning to say this for a while, but I didn't know how you'd take it." My heart started racing. What was he about to say? "You're different, Rachel. You're not like the others around here. You're vibrant. Alive." I froze. My stomach twisted into knots, and my mind raced to make sense of his words. Thank you?" I managed to stammer, unsure of where this was going. Then he leaned in closer. "I've watched you, you know." Not in a creepy way, he added quickly, though the comment did little to reassure me. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who brought light into my life." My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a casual neighborly chat anymore, it was something else entirely. And then he said it, "I need you to promise me something. That no matter what happens, this stays between us. Just you and me." What could he possibly mean by that? Why did it feel like there was a storm brewing, one that would pull me in whether I wanted it or not? But I had no idea just how far this was about to go. What happened next would turn my life into something out of a nightmare. And trust me, you'll want to stick around for this. When I first moved into this neighborhood, I was desperate for a fresh start. My breakup with Ryan had left me drained emotionally, mentally, financially. A small house in the suburbs seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of my old life. Quiet, unassuming, and far away from anything that reminded me of him. It didn't take long for me to meet Henry. He lived next door in a house that looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s, brown siding, a creaky front porch, and wind chimes that seemed to jingle constantly. The first time we spoke, he was mowing his lawn and waved me over with a wide smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he called out. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I'm just next door." He seemed harmless. Friendly, even. Over the next few weeks, Henry became a regular fixture in my life. He helped me carry groceries from the car, fix a broken latch on my fence, and even offered to assemble some furniture I'd ordered online. Such a gentleman, I'd joked to one of my coworkers over coffee. The kind of guy you wish more people were like. But there was something about him. Something that didn't quite fit the image of the perfect neighbor. It was the way his compliments felt, loaded. "You're such a hard worker," he'd say, his gaze lingering a little too long. Or, "This neighborhood feels brighter with you in it." At first, I brushed it off. Older men can be a little old-fashioned with their flattery, right? But then there was the way he watched me. It wasn't obvious, not at first. Just little moments when I'd catch him looking through his blinds as I unloaded groceries, or how he always seemed to know when I'd just come home from work. One evening, I was out watering my plants when Henry walked over with 2 glasses of iced tea. "You've been out here for hours," he said, handing me one. "Thought you could use a drink." I smiled, appreciating the gesture. "Thanks, Henry. You're too kind." He leaned on the fence, looking at me with that same lingering gaze. "Kindness is rare these days, Rachel. Especially toward someone as special as you." His words made me pause, but I laughed it off and changed the subject. It wasn't a big deal, or at least, that's what I told myself. A week later, he knocked on my door. This time, he had an invitation. "I was thinking," he began, shifting on his feet, "it's been a while since I've had a proper dinner guest. Would you do me the honor of joining me for a meal tomorrow night?" I hesitated. I'd never been inside his house before, and something about the way he asked felt strange. But his smile was warm, and I didn't want to seem rude. "Sure, that sounds nice," I replied, hoping it would be nothing more than a neighborly gesture. The next evening, I found myself standing on his porch. His house was as dated inside as it was outside, wood-paneled walls, shag carpet, and the faint scent of something musty. But it was cozy, in its own way. Henry had gone all out for dinner: steak, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of red wine already open on the table. "Only the best for my favorite neighbor," he said with a wink. As we ate, the conversation turned surprisingly personal. He talked about his late wife, how lonely it had been since she passed. "You remind me of her, you know," he said, his voice soft. "Not in the way you look, but in the way you carry yourself. There's a lightness to you." I smiled politely, not knowing how to respond. By the time dinner was over, I was ready to leave, but Henry wasn't finished. "Let's have a glass of wine in the living room," he suggested, motioning toward a couch that looked older than I was. As we sat, I noticed how close he was, his knee brushing against mine. "Rachel," he began, his tone more serious now. "I need to tell you something." My stomach dropped. There was an intensity in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're the best thing to happen to me in a long time. I hope you know that." I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, trying to figure out if he meant it innocently or if there was something more behind his words. Thank you?" I stammered, standing up quickly. "It's getting late, though. I should probably get going." His face softened, and he stood too, walking me to the door. "Thanks for coming tonight," he said, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "And Rachel, don't forget what I said." I nodded, offering a forced smile as I stepped outside. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. What Henry said that night was just the beginning. And trust me, things were about to get a whole lot stranger. Sitting across from Henry that evening, I couldn't help but notice how much effort he'd put into the dinner. The steak was perfectly cooked, the wine was expensive, and the table was set with candlelight, like something out of a romance novel. At first, I thought it was just his way of being polite, an older man, lonely, trying to do something nice for a neighbor. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. Henry poured me another glass of wine, his hand steady but his eyes sharp, watching me closely. "You know, Rachel," he began, his voice soft and deliberate, "this house used to be so full of life. My wife, Claire, was the heart of it all. She'd fill the air with laughter and music. It was like magic." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "She sounds amazing. I'm sorry for your loss." His face softened, a bittersweet smile curling his lips. "She was. But life has a cruel way of taking things away from you when you least expect it. One moment, she was here, and the next, she was gone. The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, and for a moment, I felt genuine sympathy. He continued, his tone growing more introspective. It's strange, you know? How people move on, but houses, they remember. Every corner of this place has a memory. Sometimes I think I can still hear her humming in the kitchen. I tried to meet his gaze, but there was something in his eyes, something too intense. Do you ever feel like you're meant to meet certain people for a reason? He asked suddenly, catching me off guard. I guess so, I replied hesitantly, unsure of where this was going. He leaned forward slightly, his glass resting on the table between us. When I first saw you, Rachel, I felt something I haven't felt in years. It's hard to explain, but you remind me of her. My heart skipped a beat. The warmth in the room felt stifling now, and I reached for my glass just to have something to do with my hands. Thank you, I said awkwardly, forcing a smile. That's a really sweet thing to say. But he didn't stop there. You're not just beautiful, he continued, his voice lowering. You have this presence about you. Like you were meant to bring light into people's lives. My smile faltered. This was no longer just a friendly dinner. I laughed nervously, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere. Well, I'm sure Claire was the real light in your life. She sounds like an incredible woman. Henry's gaze didn't waver. She was. But she's gone now. And life doesn't stop just because you lose someone. I felt a pit forming in my stomach. I'd misjudged this whole evening. What I thought was a neighborly gesture now felt like something else. When I glanced at the clock, I realized how late it had gotten. It's been a lovely dinner, Henry, but I should probably get going. It's a work night, and I have an early morning. He smiled, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, disappointment, maybe frustration. Of course, he said, standing up to walk me to the door. But as we reached the threshold, he stopped, placing a gentle hand on my arm. Rachel, he said quietly, you're special. I hope you know that. The words were meant to be kind, but they felt like a weight pressing down on me. I nodded quickly, mumbling a thank you before stepping outside. As I walked the short distance back to my house, my mind raced. Why did I feel so unsettled? Henry had been nothing but kind, yet something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. That night, I lay in bed replaying the evening in my mind. The candles, the wine, his lingering gaze. Was I overthinking it? Or was there something deeper going on? I told myself to forget about it, to chalk it up to an awkward misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the last time Henry would try to cross that line. What happened next proved my instincts were right. And it was worse than anything I could have imagined. After that dinner, things with Henry started to change. He wasn't just the helpful neighbor anymore. Suddenly, he was everywhere. At first, it was small gestures. He'd bring over freshly baked cookies or leave flowers on my doorstep with a simple note, for the brightest light in the neighborhood, Henry. It felt harmless, though a bit excessive. I told myself he was just being kind, but deep down, something about it unsettled me. Then the notes became more personal. One day, I found a neatly folded piece of paper in my mailbox. Rachel, you're not like anyone I've ever known. Every time I see you, it feels like a piece of me comes alive again. Thank you for that. Henry. I stared at the note for a long time, unsure of what to make of it. It was flattering, sure, but also inappropriate. I hadn't given him any reason to think we were anything more than neighbors. Things escalated when he started offering to pay for things. One morning, I found him waiting outside as I was heading to work. Good morning, Rachel, he called out cheerfully, holding a steaming cup of coffee. For you, he said, handing it to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Oh, wow. Thanks, Henry, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. As I took the cup, he added casually, by the way, If you ever need help with bills or anything, just let me know. I know how tough it can be for someone in your situation." My smile froze. "That's very kind of you, but I'm fine." "Really?" He nodded, but the way he looked at me made it clear he didn't believe me. Over the next few weeks, Henry's presence became suffocating. Every time I stepped outside, there he was. If I went to the grocery store, he'd offer to carry my bags. If I was working in the yard, he'd come over with tools to help. I started avoiding him, pretending to be on the phone whenever I saw him outside or keeping my blinds closed. But it didn't seem to matter, he always found a way to insert himself into my day. One evening, I came home to find a bottle of wine on my porch with a note. "You looked stressed this morning. Thought this might help. Let me know if you want company. H." My stomach twisted as I read it. How did he know I'd been stressed? I hadn't even seen him that day. The final straw came on a Friday night. I was curled up on the couch, watching a movie, when there was a knock at the door. I checked the peephole and felt my chest tighten. It was Henry, holding another bottle of wine. I considered pretending I wasn't home, but his voice called out, "Rachel, I know you're in there. I saw your car." With a sigh, I opened the door. "Hi, Henry. It's a bit late, don't you think?" He smiled, brushing off my comment. "I won't stay long. I just need to talk to you about something important." Reluctantly, I stepped aside to let him in. As soon as he sat down, he poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me one. "Rachel," he began, his tone serious, "I think you know by now how I feel about you." My heart started to race. "Henry." He raised a hand to stop me. "Please, just let me finish. You're the first person in years who's made me feel alive again. I know there's an age difference, but I think we have a connection, something real." I felt frozen, unable to find the right words. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his hand brushing against mine. "You're special, Rachel. And I know you feel it too." He moved closer, his intention clear. "Henry, stop," I said firmly, pulling my hand away. But he didn't stop. He leaned in further, his lips inches from mine. "Please, don't fight this," he whispered. Without thinking, I pushed him back, harder than I intended. "No, Henry. This isn't okay." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression a mixture of hurt and confusion. Then he stood up abruptly, smoothing his shirt. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice cold now. "I didn't mean to upset you." I watched as he walked to the door and left without another word. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and sank onto the couch, my hands shaking. What had just happened? That night, I lay awake replaying everything in my mind. I felt angry, at him, at myself, at the entire situation. But more than anything, I felt scared. Because something told me this wasn't over. And I was right. What came next would push me to the edge and make me question everything I thought I knew about Henry, and myself. The message came late at night, just as I was getting ready for bed. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when I saw Henry's name, my stomach clenched. "I know you feel it too, Rachel. Stop fighting it. Just let yourself want this." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I should have blocked his number days ago, but some part of me, curiosity, fear, or something darker, kept me from doing it. I couldn't sleep that night. His words echoed in my mind, stirring emotions I didn't want to acknowledge. There was fear, yes, but also a strange pull. As much as I hated to admit it, I couldn't deny the magnetic tension that had been building between us. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and avoidance. Every time I saw Henry outside, I'd dart back inside or pretend to be on a call. But I couldn't escape the growing pressure, the feeling that this was far from over. Then, one evening, I snapped. It was late, past 10 p.m., and I'd been pacing my living room, unable to shake the turmoil in my chest. I grabbed my phone and stared at his message again, my thumb hovering over the block button. But instead of blocking him, I found myself texting back. "We need to talk. This can't go on." His reply was immediate. "Come over. Let's settle this once and for all." I hesitated at his doorstep, my fists clenched as I tried to summon the courage to knock. The porch light cast a dim glow, and the familiar sound of his wind chimes felt eerie in the stillness of the night. Before I could change my mind, the door opened. Henry stood there, his expression unreadable. "I knew you'd come," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. The living room felt smaller tonight, the air heavy with tension. A bottle of wine sat uncorked on the coffee table, and 2 glasses were already poured. "I don't want any wine," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. Henry didn't seem fazed. He gestured to the couch. "Sit, Rachel. Let's talk." I stayed standing. "This has to stop, Henry. Whatever you think is happening between us, it's not real. It's not, right?" He tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not real? You feel it just as much as I do. You wouldn't be here if you didn't." "I'm here to end this," I snapped, crossing my arms. He stood, closing the distance between us in a few long strides. "You can say whatever you want, but your eyes tell a different story. You're drawn to me, Rachel. Just admit it." Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. I froze, my breath hitching as his fingers lingered. "You don't have to be afraid," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "Just let yourself feel it." I should have pulled away, should have walked out the door. But in that moment, the weight of everything, the confusion, the tension, the strange pull I couldn't explain, kept me rooted in place. Henry stepped closer, his hand trailing up to my shoulder. His touch was gentle, almost hesitant, and for a brief second, I felt my resolve falter. "This is wrong," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. "Then tell me to stop," he said, his face inches from mine. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Instead, his lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, then firmer. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, caught between the urge to push him away and the undeniable pull that had been building for weeks. The kiss deepened, and I felt his hands move to my waist, pulling me closer. It was overwhelming, his intensity, the way he seemed to pour every unspoken feeling into that moment. But as the heat of the moment consumed us, a sharp voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to stop. I pulled back abruptly, breaking the connection. This can't happen," I said, my voice shaking. Henry looked at me, his expression soft but unreadable. "It already has, Rachel. You can't deny it anymore." I stepped away, wrapping my arms around myself as a wave of guilt and shame crashed over me. "I need to go," I muttered, turning toward the door. As I walked back to my house, my mind raced. The kiss lingered on my lips, but so did the weight of what had just happened. It was wrong. It was completely, utterly wrong. And yet, it had happened. In the silence of my bedroom, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I don't know how to move forward from this. I hate what happened. I hate that I let it happen. But the worst part is, this is just the beginning. And I had no idea how much worse things were about to get. The days following that night were a blur of guilt, fear, and regret. I wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, to push it so far into the recesses of my mind that it would feel like a bad dream. But Henry wouldn't let me forget. The messages started first. "Rachel, we need to talk. You can't avoid this forever. Don't make me do something we'll both regret." I ignored them all, deleting each one as soon as it appeared. But then came the phone calls. When I finally picked up, his voice was calm but chilling. "Rachel, you're making this harder than it needs to be. We're connected now, whether you like it or not. You can't just walk away." "I can, and I will," I snapped. Stay out of my life, Henry. He chuckled, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. Oh, Rachel. You really don't understand, do you? I have something that will make sure you don't go anywhere. At first, I didn't know what he meant. But then I received an email. It was from an untraceable address, but the subject line made my stomach drop, for your eyes only. I opened it with trembling hands, and there it was, video footage of that night. The angle was grainy, but clear enough to show everything. My face, his, the kiss. He had recorded it. The email included a single line, "Play nice, or this goes public." I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. My hands shook as I slammed my laptop shut, while rising in my throat. Henry didn't stop there. He began showing up at my house unannounced, standing on my porch for hours until I'd finally crack and let him in. He'd sit on my couch, pretending everything was normal while dropping veiled threats about what would happen if I didn't cooperate. "If you think your coworkers won't judge you for this, think again," he'd say with a smirk. "People love a good scandal, Rachel. They'll never see you the same way again." He was right, and he knew it. The shame alone was enough to keep me frozen in fear. But then I found something I wasn't supposed to. One evening, while Henry was in my house, I noticed his phone sitting unlocked on the table. As he stepped away to use the bathroom, curiosity and desperation got the better of me. I picked it up and scrolled through his photos. What I found made my blood run cold. There were pictures, dozens of them, of other women. Some were candid, taken from a distance, while others were more intimate. My stomach churned as I realized I wasn't the first. That night, I made a decision. If Henry wanted to play dirty, so would I. I spent the next few days digging into his life. I found out he had a history of inappropriate behavior in his previous neighborhood, something that had been hushed up by an agreement with his former neighbors. I also discovered financial records that linked him to payments made to at least 2 other women. I compiled everything I could find, determined to expose him for who he really was. When I confronted him with my findings, I expected him to crumble. Instead, he laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think anyone's going to believe you," he sneered. "You're just another woman with regrets, trying to ruin a good man's life." But I didn't stop. I sent the evidence to his employer, his neighbors, and even local news outlets. I thought I was taking control of the situation, finally standing up for myself. What I didn't anticipate was how far Henry was willing to go to protect himself. A week after I sent the evidence, I came home to find my car vandalized. The words "liar" and "whore" were spray-painted across the hood in bold, red letters. Then came the anonymous calls, the whispers at work, the strange looks from my neighbors. Henry had turned the tables, painting himself as the victim and me as the unstable woman trying to ruin his life. I thought exposing him would free me, but it only pulled me deeper into his web. I was trapped, and the worst part was knowing that this wasn't over. Henry still had the video, and he wasn't afraid to use it. What happened next would push me to the breaking point. And when the final truth came out, it shattered everything I thought I knew. I thought I was alone in this nightmare. For weeks, it felt like Henry had total control over my life, as if he was pulling the strings and I was just a puppet. But that changed the day I received an email from someone I didn't recognize. It was from a woman named Laura, and her message was chilling. "I know what he's done to you. He did it to me too. You're not the first, Rachel. But you can be the last." Attached to the email were screenshots of text messages, photos, and even a police report filed years ago. Henry had manipulated her, just like he manipulated me. He'd threatened her, humiliated her, and ultimately left her broken. But Laura wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, I connected with 2 other women who had similar stories. Each of them described the same pattern: Henry's charm, his persistence, the subtle ways he gained their trust before turning their lives into chaos. We decided to meet in person, and sitting across from them, I realized something important. I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. Together, we took everything we had, emails, texts, photos, videos, and went to the police. It wasn't easy. Reliving those moments, putting our pain on display for strangers to analyze, felt unbearable at times. But we knew it was the only way to stop him. The day Henry was arrested, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a deep sadness for everything I'd lost. But I also felt something else, strength. For the first time in months, I could breathe again. As the news about Henry spread, the comments from people in the neighborhood started rolling in. Some were supportive, others doubted our story, claiming he was too kind or harmless to do such things. But I didn't care. For every person who doubted us, there were others who reached out with their own stories, their own moments of fear and manipulation. If you're still watching, here's what I want you to take away from my story. Trust is fragile, and sometimes, the people who seem the kindest are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. If something feels wrong, trust your instincts. Speak up, even if it feels impossible. You're stronger than you think. I know this story might leave you with questions or even anger. What would you have done in my place? Could you have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts.